greetings to you here, and I know that we have more than this number coming in on webcam as well, so you're all welcome wherever you are. It's my honor to introduce our 23rd Distinguished Wilson Abernethy Lecturer, Dr. Maxi Szinovacz, who is from the Department of Gerontology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she holds the Frank J. Manning Eminent Scholars Chair in Gerontology. Maxi truly deserves the adjective eminent. Her research does a wonderful job of combining family sociology and gerontology. She has more than 70 articles published in the leading journals in both fields. Maxi's work has substantially contributed to our theoretical understanding of the dynamics of later life families. Maxi received her doctorate from the University of Vienna. She's been a faculty member in the United States for 35 years, teaching at Penn State, Old Dominion University, and Eastern Virginia Medical School. Maxi has also served as director of the Gerontology Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I've had the pleasure of knowing Maxi for almost 15 years. It was surprising for me when I counted it up, due to our mutual interest in grandparenting research. Maxi's Handbook of Grandparenthood is a seminal work in the field, and I still use it frequently. She's published 3 other important books, including the earliest book on women's retirement. Her most recent book is on the topic of caregiving. Maxi has also been a caregiver for her mother, so she knows the topic intimately as well as academically. Maxi's presentation today will explore how care is distributed among family members and to what extent caregivers within the family change over time. Her lecture is titled The Distribution and Dynamics of Caregiving Among Adult Children. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Maxi Szinovacz. Thank you, Maxi.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming on this wonderful day where everybody wants to be anywhere else but in a dark theater. The research I'm going to talk about today, you have to excuse this funny setup, but I have a bad back, and if I stand the whole hour, I will probably never walk again. My co-investigator on all of this, I have to go back, is Adam Davey, whom I want to acknowledge. And we've worked together, I think, the last 10 years, so it's been quite a while. I also have to acknowledge, obviously, our funders, which is the National Institute on Health, specifically National Institute on Aging. And the data I'm referring to are from the Health and Retirement Study, which is conducted by the University of Michigan and also funded by NIH. I would like to say that some of the materials that I'm showing you here have been published. Other sources are new and to some extent preliminary, so consider this a work in progress. So let me go to the, and also if you want to know more about this topic, you can get this from our book. It's an edited book on caregiving contexts, cultural, familial, and societal implications, which came out 2 years ago, I believe. Before I start with our real lecture, I want to throw some numbers at you. When we talk about things today, the only thing that counts is money, right? Okay, so caregiving, it's not just family, it's something that has to do with money. These are charts which you can download from the internet, by the way, and this is on your slide here, that show estimates of how much caregiving is worth. These data are from Peter Arno, who is at the Montefiore Medical Center and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And he gave these figures at a presentation for the the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry in 2000. He estimates that the costs of caregiving in 2000 were approximately around $250, $260 billion per year. As you see, the estimates vary widely. Just to give you a comparison, in a publication by ARP they used 2006 data, they estimate caregiving costs informal caregiving costs, I should say, to be about $354 billion. So that kind of is in the same price range here. In other words, caregiving is something that has enormous economic value. And this becomes even clearer if you compare it with other care costs. Home care, based on these same estimates, that's all from Arno's presentation, are $32 billion. Nursing home care are estimated at $92 billion. So you see that informal caregiving costs are more than double what the formal care, the home care, and the nursing home care is worth. Also, we are dealing with a lot of people. According to Peter Arno again, the estimate is that there were about 9.5 million care recipients in 2000, and somewhere between 25 and 29 million caregivers. The ARP estimates from 2006 are somewhere between 30 to 38 million care recipients. The numbers increase dramatically because we're now starting to see the beginning of the very early baby boom cohorts starting to perhaps need a little care. And also there's differences in how you count caregivers and who is a caregiver and who is not and so forth. So estimates vary a little bit. What I want to do today is to talk about dynamics and structure of caregiving. I'm not going to talk about caregiver stress and issues like that. Why is this so important to look at these structural issues? Well, for one thing, as you just have seen, based on these numbers, states, governments, countries rely very strongly on informal care to satisfy the need for caregiving. And there are important structural changes that are going to occur. First of all, the large baby boom cohorts are going to become care recipients, which means that the population of care recipients will increase tremendously. And then there are some demographics that are not so good, perhaps. What is going to happen is that what we are currently having, what most of our research has been dealing with, because we are dealing with current or earlier data, is baby boom parents as care recipients who have a lot of children who can provide care. Also, in those cohorts, divorce was relatively rare. So what we're going to have in the future are baby boom children who do not have a lot of children and who are very prone to divorce. Does that matter? And I hope by the end of this lecture you'll be able to answer that question. If we deal with, from a research perspective now, with the caregiving research and look at it, what do we have? We have a lot of studies that focus on the primary caregiver. They don't even ask about anybody else. Practically all the research is cross-sectional. It only deals with caregiving at one point in time. Many studies are based on small and non-representative samples. There are some exceptions to that, both in Canada and in the United States. And then there's also an issue of result of sensitivity to response bias and measurement, and I will get back to that issue later in the lecture, but I want to for you to keep that in mind. So what we are doing is a little bit different. We examine the distribution of care and the structure of caregiving, and we are looking at it. So we are looking at many caregivers and how that relates to each other, and we are looking at things over time. So we have longitudinal data to deal with. And we are relying on a nationally representative, very large database, which you need to do that. What I'm going to talk about is I'm first going to briefly introduce you to our theoretical model, then I'll talk very briefly and not in detail about methods. And then I will touch upon four main topics, although the 5 and 6 are related to each other. The first is the division of care between adult-child spouses. The second one is the general distribution of help among caregivers. And then 5 and 6 deal with changing caregivers over time and the predictors of such change. And then I'll conclude quickly. Let us first look at the entire project. I'm first going to, what we are doing in that project is basically 3 things. We're going to identify family support networks. We are going to identify the factors that influence these family support networks, and especially change in these networks. And then we are also going to look at the outcomes of such changes. I'm not going to touch upon the outcomes in this lecture, primarily because we haven't gotten there yet in our analysis. Okay, let us look at what theories are currently available in the field. One of the major theories is the so-called hierarchical compensatory theory by Cantor, which essentially says that care occurs in a hierarchy where the closest family members are asked upon or relied upon first, followed by less closely related people, and then non-relatives. Another theoretical basis deals with gender ideology, and here particularly we're dealing with women as kin-keepers as one framework. So the norm is that women should do the caregiving, not men. But there's another norm that deals with the match between caregiver gender and gender of the care recipient. And essentially, the norm there is that same-sex caregivers are preferred. Then we have the whole thing about filial responsibility norms, which tie in with the hierarchical compensatory model, of course, that essentially say children and also spouses, but the filial refers to the children, of course, have an obligation to assist their ailing parents. And then we have models that try to explain under which circumstances, it has primarily been used for adult children, but it should apply to other caregivers to some extent too, help or don't help. Among the major models are the economic altruism and reciprocity models, as well as the behavioral health care utilization models. Resources. That's an item from primarily the behavioral health care model, such as incomes and other helpers may influence whether people help, because, for instance, if you have a lot of money, you can buy help. If there are a lot of other helpers, you can rely on them. Parents' needs and children's ability, or caregivers' ability, are the focus of the altruism model. So essentially, to each according to his need, from each according to their ability. And that comes from Marx, by the way, in case you didn't get that. So it's not a very young model. But these days it's called the altruism model, and it's used primarily by economists. And so factors that would be considered there, for instance, the parents' health conditions, of course, their age, their marital status, and from the caregiver's perspective, whether other family members are available, and their other obligations, employment, children, and also availability in terms of proximity. And then there's the reciprocity model. Well, the reciprocity model goes about like this. It usually isn't quite that crude, but essentially we're dealing with past and future support exchange. The support for the reciprocity model is kind of mixed, but for some families it works. We're just doing a small pilot study where we're looking at how siblings report on care, and we're interviewing 2 of them to see how their reports match, which is very interesting. One of the things we're detecting is that while one sibling wants to participate in the study, the other does not, which is a problem. But, for instance, one of the people we interviewed there said, well, I and my sister help our mother, and our brothers don't help, and so she's going to leave everything to us. Now, that's a reciprocity perspective. That's in terms of future reward. But it could also be past rewards in terms of early expenses for education, for instance, or some other help. Okay, the whole model we are dealing with here, which is the one that we put in our grant application, kind of, is we're looking at contextual factors that affect who will help, and these factors then define the structure of the support network that then has outcomes both for the caregivers and the care recipients. And these specific outcomes feed back into the caregiver and care recipient situation. For instance, insufficient care may increase the need for care, which then will require restructuring of the care support network, and also restructuring maybe of who helps because of the different needs. or changes in the caregivers' outcomes might also require that one caregiver drops out because they can't do it any longer. And so, again, you get this feedback loop. As I said earlier, I will primarily emphasize the left side of this model, so we're looking primarily at the structure of the support system and how it changes over time. Methods. Well, as I mentioned before, we use data from the United States Health and Retirement Study, which was conducted by University of Michigan, is funded by NIH, and is representative for the United States. They started the HRS, as it is called, in 1992 with an initial cohort of people aged 51 to 61. And the initial cohort they interviewed was about 10,500 people. And that included primary respondents and their spouses. So we always have spouse data in the HRS, which is very nice. And then in 93, they added the so-called AHEAD, which consisted of the older people, 70 and over cohort. In 1998, these two cohorts were combined, and they also added new cohorts that were kind of the in-between cohorts and younger cohorts. And they keep adding cohorts now. They interview people every 2 years. So now we are from 92 to 2010, and they have done the interviews every 2 years. And by now we have over 30,000 people that were at some point in time in the HRS. I mean, some people are added and some people drop out, so it's not a total of 30,000 at this point in time. But overall, it is a really big survey. There are two sources of data on caregiving in the HRS. One is they asked respondents, the younger respondents from the 51 to 61 age group, and are you taking care of your parents? And so you have data where the caregivers report on care they give to their parents, and also, and that referred to basic needs as well as money. And then, which applies primarily to the older cohorts in the HRS, they asked respondents on whether they are receiving care for ADLs, IADLs, activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, and money management. And who helped them if they needed help. So you have two perspectives in a sense. And I will refer to the first one as caregiver reports, and for the second one is care recipient reports, just to keep that in your mind. Okay. As far as the respondent children, the caregivers reports are concerned, the data I'm using are from waves between 1992 and 2000, and because the numbers of caregivers are relatively small at any one point in time, and we'll talk about that later also, we pooled data. So if you give care between 1992 and 1994, you are part of our sample. If you give care between, let's say, 1994 and 1996, you represent another occasion in the sample, and so forth. So the same children can be several times in the sample. We, of course, use statistics that adjust for interdependence of observations and so forth. We have, in the data that I'm talking about, I think over 1,000 care occasions of that sort. Some of the analyses only use adult children that have no more than 4 siblings because they didn't get detailed data on more than 4 siblings of the caregiver. For the care recipient reports, the analyses are based on individual waves because we have enough people to just look at individual waves, or 2 waves that are next to each other, like 1998 and 2000, or 2000 and 2002. And there the N varies depending on which kind of help you're looking at. The N is about between 478 for money management to 829 for IADLs in one wave. Or for the longitudinal analysis, sorry, between 1998 and 2000. So that's people who get help at both times. As far as the questions go, I have to hurry because otherwise I won't get to the result. The caregivers were asked whether they provided care to their parents, and if so, how many hours they and their spouses did provide. And the respondents were asked whether they whether they needed care. I'm going relatively quickly now, with activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, and money management. Now, I talked earlier about result sensitivity, so I want to throw a graph at you here, which is very interesting. I'm looking here at caregiver and care recipient reports about help by children-in-law. Remember, the caregivers were asked how many hours they and their spouses helped. So we know whether their spouses helped. And the care recipients were asked about who helps, and they could name children-in-law. If you compare the reports, there's an enormous difference. Children-in-law are very rarely mentioned by care recipients, and they're mentioned a lot by the caregivers, who say that their spouses also help. Why? Which is another thing that's very interesting. You really need two perspectives to get at these things. Why might that be? Well, for one thing, we are dealing with a different time frame. The caregivers report on whether they have provided help since the last wave. So we're dealing with a 2-year time span during which the spouse could have helped at any point in time, whereas the care recipients talk about now. Secondly, there is a difference in the range of activities. The question to the caregivers that the adult children is kind of, do you help your parents with basic needs such as eating and dressing? And the such as opens a door to include all kinds of activities which you don't know what they are. Whereas the care recipients were asked about very specific activities, like activities of daily living. Do you get help with eating? Or do you get help with dressing? Or do you get help with money management, for the money management? And who helps you with this specific task or activity? So that it's much more specific. Then there might be invisible help. If the husband, let's say, cooks the meal, that then the wife takes to her mother. She doesn't necessarily know that, the mother. So there might be invisible help involved that the care recipient doesn't see, but that occurs. And then, of course, there's this issue about memory. We are dealing with people in the care recipient population who are older and therefore probably more prone to memory problems. In fact, many of them have IADL help, which implies that they have some memory problems, maybe, than the younger cohorts. So that may play a role as well. Okay, let's look a little bit how spouses divide care. When we think about care to parents, this is the image that most of us get. You know, first, mom takes care of us, and it's the mother who is behind the baby carriage, not the father. And then later on in life, it is the daughter who takes care of the mother, and she's behind the wheelchair and not the son. Is that really true? Well, first of all, how do we measure the relative participation of husbands? Essentially, it's a proportional kind of measure which originally comes from a publication by Sorensen and McLenaghan, who tried to figure out married women's economic dependency on men, but we are applying the same formula to the division of caregiving between spouses. Essentially, what you need to keep in mind is the higher the score, the more the husband does. What do we find? These are only significant predictors. The model was much larger, so we had more norms in there, more cultural context variables, and more ability need factors. And incidentally, the last two items here really belong to ability need rather than to resources. A little bit misplaced here. And we have also many more resources in the model. What we find was the major predictor were, first of all, whose parent it is, the wives or the husbands. Secondly, whether the parent is female or male. And these two factors are by far the most important. I went in the wrong. If you look at the distribution of husbands' relative participation in care by gender of the parent and whose kinship relationship, there are tremendous differences. I mean, you rarely find that kind of difference in our sociological type of research. But we're going from nearly 0% for husband not doing anything in the case of husband's father to something around 50% when we are dealing with the wife's mother. That is a difference. That is a real difference. And on the other hand, we have nearly 30% of husbands doing all the help for their own fathers. And, well, less than 5% doing so for the wife's mother. So kinship and gender of the care recipient are really very important predictors. Other factors we find is that blacks, who are known to have more egalitarian gender norms as a rule, and couples who engage in joint leisure activities also have more husband participation, as do those who care for another parent as well, which is kind of double obligation, and apparently if one spouse's need for help is very great and the other spouse does help. And then in terms of resources and other ability factor, the more income, the less the husband does. He probably pays the help rather than doing it himself. More siblings, less help by the husband because there are other potential caregivers there. The more the husband works relative to the wife, the less he does. That's a commitment factor, and healthier husbands do more also. So that's one of the things we were looking at. And I will skip, I already told you all of this, so I'm not going to. This is very slow here. Okay. Now let us look at something else now. Let us look at the structure of care. And before we do that, let's look about who are these help recipients in terms of their gender and their marital status. And this is now care recipient reports from the HRS. And what you can see is that the turquoise group is, of course, the largest. And the turquoise group is who? Unmarried females. Which, of course, also corresponds with the relative structure of the population at that age. You have more unmarried females. And then also married females. And then you have married males and unmarried males. Very few unmarried males. Now, if we go back to our distribution of care between spouses and the importance of kinship, especially same-sex kind of preference for same-sex care, we always think that daughters help because there are these norms that make women help. And of course there are these norms. But one other factor that's important is that the structural setting of care recipients population is such that it increases, in a sense, the opportunities for women to help much more than it does for men if you have a same-sex caregiver norm. Okay. I looked only at individuals age 70 and over. Some of the other analysis dealing with care recipients also include some of the younger individuals. Overall, between 1998 and 2002, and I'm dealing with individual waves here, about, depends on which you're looking at, 10 to 20% of HRS participants age 70 and over require some help. Mostly with IADLs, followed by ADLs, and much less with money management. Who are the people who help? Spouses, adult children, daughters and sons, other females, other female relatives a little bit for ADLs, and professionals, formal help. But the big groups are really adult children, spouses, formal help. For IDLs, you have a very similar picture. For money management, this changes insofar as children do much more, Spouses do relatively less compared to children. And what this means is that, which is kind of interesting, apparently some spouses may not be willing to rely on their own spouse. They'd rather go to their own children for money management. But what basically disappears is formal help. Professionals do not manage money. They do help with IDLs, they help with ADLs, but they don't manage money. That's a family thing. Okay, now who are the caregivers? Well, we have spouses, and this is again by marital status, and of course, if the spouse helps, you don't have any unmarried individuals. Although there are a couple of people, that I really mean a handful, that report they have ex-spouses help, but that's very rare. So if they're married, the spouse helps, and there's this, practically all the spouses are then involved. Then you have adult children helping, and of course they help much more if you're not married. And then you have formal help, again, much more if you're not married. So if you're married, the spouse is the big caregiver. And if you're not, then it's somebody else. I also looked at types of help received. What is interesting is about 1/2 of the sample gets help only with one of these three things, ADLs, IDLs, or money management. About 1/3 gets help with 2 of them, and about 1/5 gets help with all 3. So that's a relatively small population. We also looked at who helps those who require the most care, those who really need all 3 of them, and how many tasks do caregivers take on under this circumstance. So the care recipients get 3 types of help. The question is who helps, how many helpers are involved. If they get help from the spouse does everything. If they get spouse from other people, they usually apparently divide tasks up because very few do all of them. The daughters do, there's a good proportion of daughters that do all of it, but sons don't, other females don't, former helpers don't. So it is primarily spouses and to some extent the daughters who take on all tasks that are required, whereas the other helpers clearly share help with somebody else or share care with somebody else. So overall, we have a confirmation of the hierarchical compensatory model. We have strong gender effects. We have very little money management outside the family. And we have very clear effects of marital status. I'm trying to get to my next thing. So now let's talk about the big thing of change and why it's so important to look at longitudinal data. I did a little experiment a little while ago to look what difference does it make when you look at things cross-sectionally and longitudinally. And these are essentially caregiver reports I'm referring to here. And so I first looked at, if I just looked at how many of these adult children in the HIS care for a parent in one wave, you get less than 10% regardless of which wave you're looking at, anytime between 1992 and 2000. Then I look at the whole time period between 1992 and 2000. So the whole 10 years. Well, that jumps now to over 25%. Then I look at whether the respondents care not only for their own parent, but maybe also for parent-in-law. Then I get to over 30%. And then I look at whether the respondent or their siblings care for either their parents or a parent-in-law. Because if the sibling cares for the parent, then the respondent is potentially at risk of becoming a caregiver, because the parent needs care. Just right now, the siblings are providing this care. And then I'm over 50%. Cross-sectional, under 10. Longitudinally, at least 30% over a 10-year period. And if you look at potential risk, you're way up there, in over 50%. So you can see how misleading cross-sectional data can be. Incidentally, this same statistics and the same issue applies to all that research that has been published on the sandwich generation. That's all cross-sectional data at one point in time, and the reason why the numbers are so extremely small is because at any one point in time there are no caregivers either. So you can't get sandwich caregivers if you don't have caregivers in the first place. But that's just an aside. These are care recipient reports again. And I looked at continuity over time. For those 70 and over, those who received help in 1998, most of them also received help in the 2 years later. So there is a lot of continuity in care. Another thing to look at in terms of longitudinal is how many caregivers are involved at any one point in time. If you look at cross-sectional data, primarily it's just one caregiver, although the proportion that get help from several, except for money management, is noteworthy. I mean, it's over 40%. If you look at it longitudinal, and that's just a 2-year period, the proportion who only receive help from one helper, except for money management, drops way under 50%. What happens? Well, some helpers, and I counted all the people that were involved in care as reported by the care recipient in 98 and in 2000. And so if caregivers are added to the network, you have more caregivers, of course. So again, looking at longitudinally, you have many more people involved than cross-sectional data would indicate. On the other hand, if you look at the total number of caregivers over time, that remains relatively stable. Relatively. So about 70% for money management, it's higher, of the care recipients receive help from the same number of people over time. But it's not necessarily the same people. They just keep the overall numbers steady. So, going back to spouse care and other care, how continuous is the help by specific individuals? Is Goldie really lawfully wedded to this care recipient husband for the rest of her life? For the care recipient reports, we looked at the change in adult, child, and spouse caregivers for care recipients who received care in 2000 and in 2002 are the same people involved, and how does it change? And you have some people who report continuing caregivers and no change. So there's no new person, no person drops out, it's all the same. Then you have some that have a new caregiver start, some that have a caregiver stop, and then some where that person that we're dealing with here is not involved at all. This is a little bit misleading for children in terms of the knots because of how the data were handled. It's too complex to go into that. So the knot is a little bit underestimated here. But what you see, what's important is that unfortunately Goldie probably will have to do this until death do us part. As you see, the continuity for spouses is very high, over 70%, whereas it is much lower for adult children, except for money management. Now, I'm going to go into very quickly a different, the same question, changing caregivers, but now from the caregiver's perspectives. And what we did there is we essentially aggregated the adult-child's data to the system level. So we can then tell, for a specific parent, did any child in the system start care? Did any child in the system stop care? Did everybody continue so there's no change? Or was there an exchange where one child was added to the network and another one stopped? And what we find, and I have a lot of graphs here. I won't show you all of them, or I won't talk about all of them. But some of them are really quite interesting. This one in particular, if you look at the number of children that this parent has, then those with only 2 children have substantially more continuity than those that have 5 children, because there's more availability. So if one child can't do it, you get another one in, and so forth. So children do change over time substantially. Overall, incidentally, the change rate is in about 50% of the cases, the care occasions, so to speak. Any caregiver change occurs. And in about 30%, around 30%, a little under 30%, for primary caregivers over a 2-year period. Quite a bit of change. Another thing we looked at was, and incidentally, these figures all come from multinomial logit models, and then we estimated the probabilities from that. So this is not just bivariate data. If they're caregivers of both sexes, there's much more change than if caregivers, the children that parents have are all the same sex. I don't know. We have to do the individual level analysis for the children yet. So I don't want to generalize from the system level to the individual level, because you really are not allowed to do that. but one could be suspicious that it might be the males that drop out. But I don't know that. So there is another finding, for instance, is that if there is a female non-caregiver at the first wave that we're looking at available, then change is much more likely to occur, especially for a new caregiver to start, than if no female non-caregiver exists at the first wave. We also find, and I'm going to go through this now quickly, we also find effects of grandchildren, whether they have dependents, and all kinds of factors. So what does this all mean? The changes in the care networks are contingent both on normative and availability factors. Normative effects are suggested by the influence of the caregiver's gender composition and the proximity of female but not of male non-caregivers. So only the female, not obliged yet, caregivers live close by, not the males. Availability effects, I haven't shown you these, but those deal with obligations. So people who have dependents, if there are people with dependents in the network, there's more likely to be some stopping of care, for instance. And if people with marital commitments or with grandchildren are in the network, there's more likely to be some stopping or some exchange of care. Whereas, on the other hand, if people who don't have these obligations are present, there is also more change. So it's the balancing out of this obligation that really matters. And sometimes the availability may also be related in a kind of not expected way, where people are available from a specific non-obliged groups, like men with no grandchildren. And in this case, there is less stopping of care. And what that might mean is simply that the only caregivers that are available are totally non-available. Maybe they live on the other side of the world or something like that. And so the current caregivers really can't stop. What can we conclude from all of this? Well, first of all, I hope I have convinced you that cross-sectional data are not enough in many cases, and they give a very questionable view of the world, because you tend to underestimate and overestimate things, because the world is not just existing at one point in time. You have the same thing with nursing home. If you ask how many people are in a nursing home at any one point in time, you give a very low percentage, whereas the risk of being ever in a nursing home is much higher. Same is true for caregiving. But most people look at nursing home use over a longer time period, but not at caregiving. So we need to use the same kind of approach for caregiving. They also fail to show these fluctuations in caregivers that occur, and as I said before, they are substantial. Our findings suggest that the available relatives, especially adult children, who are not involved in care at any one point in time, might become so in the future. And that there are very specific factors that affect whether they will do so or not. that include normative issues and obligation issues, ability issues, and so forth. Now, let me go back to the beginning. Does it matter that our demographics are changing? Well, if care networks and large care networks of adult children that care recipients have now really serve as a safety net for caregivers who cannot continue, and there is the possibility of change, and there is sharing of care, for which we find quite a bit of evidence, then demographics are going to matter a great deal. Also, the fact that spouses are so important as caregivers, and the fact that we will have much fewer spouses in the future matters a lot, because spouses really do a lot of caregiving. And very complex caregiving, but they take care of everything, and continuously over time. So what we are going to see in the future is a very large population of people who will require care from a much smaller network of caregivers. And then the question becomes, of course, where are they going to get care? Are they going to get care? And who is going to pay for it? Because, remember, the value, the economic value of informal care is greater, much greater, than any of the institutional and formal care we currently have. Thank you.
Hello. Is this on? Yes? Okay. My name is Professor Rafael Gomez, and I'm representing the Center for Investor Relations and Human Resources, one of the co-sponsors of this event. And you might have thought at first, when Lynn mentioned that we were a co-sponsor, kind of what's the angle? This is caregiving, it's aging. But this last slide, I think, really drove that point home, that there's a huge demand and for this need in society, and it will be met, has to be met, given the demographics from a formal sector that is still nascent and developing. And we at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources are very keen to understand this growing need, and it's a pleasure to see such a well-argued presentation, and one filled with data that comes from the US, obviously, but one that has huge ramifications for Canada. Because actually, Canada's baby boom was actually bigger, and our bust was actually bigger. So we have kind of fewer people in that smaller cohort who will be taking care of more of the baby boom generation. So quite an amazing lecture, and we really appreciate you coming and giving that to us here. So we can give a big round of applause. That's yeah. Now, I would like to do two things. I want to open the floor to questions, and secondly, also remind people that after the questions are over, there's a small reception, actually, a big reception, everyone's invited, in the Buttery. It's a great name, but it's just here in the theater, next to the theater, and there'll be some finger food and drinks for everyone, and that will happen right after the questions and answers are taken up. So, without further ado, if there's any questions that we can take from the floor, and I can begin to point to people. If you'd like, I could start, because I had one in my brain kind of turning over. So one of the big questions I have is America is also, you didn't quite touch on it here, but it's a place of huge mobility. People move state to state in big numbers, in big ways. And retired population moves equally in big numbers. I wonder how that reflects in any of the survey work you've done. And it's just a personal interest, but how the fact that America is the place, and North America to some extent, of huge mobility, not so much in Europe, and how that affects caregiving and this informal sector that usually picks up the burden, but perhaps is restricted in some way by this huge mobility.
Well, for one thing, there are two types of mobility in old age. The one is the retirement mobility, where you go to summer land, like Florida and Arizona and so forth. And the second is the back mobility, where you go wherever they can give you care. So there is not just the out mobility, there's the back mobility. And the other observation is that, in fact, most people, despite the mobility, have adult children, some adult child living close by.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Quite interesting. Yes, question there. Would you like to come to the podium so that it can be heard?
I can talk from here.
I think it's so that they can hear, because they're videotaping, recording. If you don't mind, sorry. Yeah, thanks. It's like The Price is Right here. Just step on up to me.
I was wondering, when you're looking at the adult children taking care of the aging parents, was there a bias in terms of the firstborn?
We didn't look at that. I'm not sure. We can look at that for the adult children, for the care recipient reports. There we have age. We do have age of siblings. So we might be able to do that, but we didn't look at that specifically. It's a good question, though.
Excellent one. Yes, question.
Having 4 children, I'm always interested in the predictors of involvement in childcare, and high education for males is a very significant or very substantial predictor for caregiving down the generational ladder. I noticed I was looking for education, and it didn't seem to come through. Was it not significant?
I think it might have been knocked out by income.
Oh, okay, so correlated.
It wasn't a significant predictor. I'm sure we had it in the model.
Okay. Interesting.
But in terms of caregiving, it might be more of a resource issue, where if you can buy the help, you'd rather do that.
It was you then, I was pointing.
Me?
I thought you were stepping up
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
mic.
yeah. Maxie, that was really interesting. One of the things I noticed was the unmarried group and the high level of care they required. And I'm wondering who's in that unmarried group. Does that mean never married, or does it mean divorced, widowed, separated?
Everybody.
So it includes everybody. It's
Yeah,
not the never
everybody
married.
who doesn't currently have a spouse.
Yeah, because I was wondering about the never married, because they would be a small group, but they would really be in a bit of a pickle, because who'd be looking after them?
Yeah,
Nieces, nephews?
we can eventually divvy it up.
Yeah, and look
But
at
for
that.
these analyses, we put them all together, because I was particularly interested to show differences between adult children and spouses. And of course, then you would have to get into 6 kind of column groups.
Right. Yeah,
And,
it gets
and so
complicated.
forth. It gets very
And
complicated.
there's not enough
Yeah, but in
problem.
these analyses, they were
Yeah.
combined.
The other thing I was wondering about was the single child caregiver. And if that's the case, when there's a number of caregivers.
They don't exist in our analysis, because for those, there is no possibility of change. What we can do, and we should probably do that, is to take our data and compare them with those that have no siblings. We were particularly interested in adult-child network changes, and whether children drop in and out. And that, of course, you can only do if you have more than 2 or more. But we could look at whether the continuity of care is different for the single children compared to those who have no siblings, compared to those that do have. And that's a good thing that you asked, because that's certainly something we can do and should do. Thank you.
Question there?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually have two questions on completely different aspects of it.
Good, sure.
One was, from the data that you had, did you have information about ethnic or language background or culture, and did that affect the findings?
No, we just looked at race and ethnicity in terms of Hispanic or not Hispanic. Beyond that, you get into too small numbers. We don't have enough numbers to do much with that. Plus, we also don't have enough detail.
Right. Thank you. And then
but it's certainly something. I mean, there is some qualitative research that certainly indicates that there are some real cultural issues involved in care. Even if you just look at race, I mean, the culture of caregiving among black families, for instance, who are really opposed to nursing homes, and that kind of culture is very different from whites and so forth. And also the feelings about care. For instance, we did a study on, which is also very interesting, it hasn't been done a lot, at children of caregivers and how they feel about the care situation. And that was a small qualitative study. And one of the things that struck me, and you can't really show that with data that easily, but because they don't, a black kid will not, an African American kid will not tell you I'm thinking differently about this than this white kid, you know. So you kind of get this sense when you interview them or when you read the interviews that there's a difference there, but it's not in the reports themselves. And one of the things that struck me in this kind of intuitive fashion was that the white kids felt much more that the grandmother who was living with them, those were all live-in relatives, they're being taken care of, was kind of a stranger in the household. Whereas for the black kids, that wasn't the case. And in many cases, they had lived with the grandparents before, at their house in some cases, and so forth. So there are real differences. So it's a very good question, but we don't have that detailed data to go after it in the HRS.
It's really interesting. The second question I had was relating to smaller families having more continuous caregiving, and whether, in spite of the financial burden that we will surely experience in the States and in Canada in the next, 40 years, is there any hope that having smaller families will actually mean the children will embrace that responsibility?
Well, children do embrace their responsibility, and what's going to happen is that they will have to provide more continuous care, in a sense. But the problem with that is that we're always thinking about caregiving in terms of the way we count it, at least economically, is what would it cost if you would have to replace the caregiver? There's another economic cost of caregiving. We know that caregiving is stressful. We know that caregiving has health effects. And health problems are economically also an issue. So you might still have you will still have continuous caregivers to some extent because they have no alternative. But the fact that they have to do care with no alternative is more likely to make them sick than if they had the alternative. I can't prove that at this point in time, but and because then they have no outlet for the stress. And then you have healthcare costs. So, it goes in all kinds of directions.
Another question?
My question was, and thank you very much for that really eloquent, lovely display of information and how you put it together. My question bears on what you just said. I was just wondering if you had any information on the long-term consequences for, in particular, women, the long-term economic impact from your structural data, and then you said you did interviews, so are there any qualitative data that you have that you could make the connection? Because most certainly if it's unmarried women looking after their parents, then there's going to be potentially a health issue that comes down the line, and so your data have interesting implications if you don't have the answers for connecting it with that research that is out there and how that impacts. So that's my first question.
Yes. I have two answers to your question. First, looking at the aftermath of care, the long-term effects of care, the aftermath. That's our next grant proposal. Secondly, Lynn has done research on that issue, so she should be able to really answer that question.
I don't know whether Lynn wants to answer that.
No,
but I
Lynn does not want to answer that question.
Well, answering the question, I can only, it's still in progress. We've done over 100 in-depth interviews after the caregiving's over, and the general response overall has been that women and some men suffer financially rather seriously as a result. There's a British study of cross-sectional data that is a random stratified sample in Britain that shows very clearly that any caregiver's income in old age is much lower than someone who never provided care. We have used the General Social Survey for the 1996 module, and we're now using it for the 202 module. And in both instances, we're comparing those who care gave and those who never care gave. And again, their income is way lower, but we can't say why. We can say more of why from the qualitative stuff.
And that's the economic aspect.
Yeah,
then there's
it's
the health
economic,
aspect and
yeah.
all the other.
We didn't do the health. We are only doing economics.
Fascinating. And so I guess that was my second question about have you compared these data to any European data, and are we seeing the same things over there? Because my sense is that in Britain, I know for sure, but I'm not sure about Europe, there's much more a cohesiveness, especially for elderly people, and supports with whether it's extended family or extended neighborhoods in a much more closer knit situation that's very, very different from the North American aspect. So I'm wondering whether the same patterns cross the Atlantic, so to speak.
I'm not sure that anybody has done the same kind of longitudinal analysis. The big studies in Europe that have European data on it, the one was the now a little bit older study, the OASIS data that Ariela Löwenstein and some other people from Israel and so forth were involved in. But that's a cross-sectional data set. And the share data, which is the kind of the parallel of the HRS in Europe, they haven't done they don't have longitudinal data yet, or at least they haven't published out of them, because they started only a few years ago.
Okay, thank you. And
but there will be data like that.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
And the
And
cross-sectional
actually,
point
we
you made
want
is
to
superb.
look at. We do want to look at the comparisons between Europe and
I think it'd be interesting for
Yes,
a number of
definitely.
reasons. Which brings me to my last question. I'm sorry, but all my questions.
No problem.
And this has implications for what you're studying, and so I don't know whether you can answer it. So, given all this, we're heading for perhaps a crisis situation. What are potentially some of the solutions for us? Because it really is economically, health-wise, and a number of otherwise, socially, a very important thing we have to address.
Oh, I'm not a prophet either, but well, among the things that probably might happen is the involvement of a larger network of helpers. including volunteers among the elderly themselves, which we will have a lot of. And not all of these retirees will be in this exactly the same age. So there is the potential of the younger retirees to take care of the older retirees who are not related to each other. If you have a large population of older people, then you have that option. So that is one possibility. The other possibility, the other options are how you combine these specific care requirements. Because a lot of it also has to do with coordinating formal and informal care, which it currently isn't, or very little. And if you coordinate it properly, then you can probably rely on fewer relatives as caregivers who need some informal help with their help, but not to the same extent as if you rely totally on formal help. But I think that then the issue becomes how you coordinate this really well and how you structure it well. Because right now, from my own experience with my mother, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work at all. You hire somebody from an agency, and they're supposed to come at 8 and leave at 2 when you come back from the university, and your class starts at 8:30, and of course they don't come, and because whatever, and the agency doesn't know that because they don't tell the agency. And so there you sit, and you have a class there, and you have the care recipients, your mother sitting there and needing help, and what do you do? And so there's a lot that doesn't work right now in terms of coordination. This is just one of those examples. And also, this might be more costly, but eventually more efficient. It might be that we will have to elevate the quality of the former caregivers so that the care they give is really appropriate and the right thing, and not that you get somebody, you hire somebody who is supposed to do ADL care, dressing, bathing, blah, 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 and then they come to your house and say, well, no, I will not shower your mother because I could get wet. That kind of thing has, of course, a lot to do with the fact that we pay minimum wage to caregivers, former caregivers. And so, there are a lot of issues in that whole scenario between formal and informal care that need fixing. And if some of these issues will get fixed, hopefully over time, then things might get more efficient, at least. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll take one last question, and then we'll, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for doing this research, because I think, and the people in the room, it is critically important on a professional and personal level and societal level for all of us. And I was just wondering, as well as your professional publications, is there a format for you to take this to the people who can make policy changes or make the decisions, because that's who needs to hear this kind of thing, not the small handful of academics working in the area. It needs to be taken out. So I was just wondering what avenues are available.
We publish the things, and we write them up, and we talk about them, and it gets through. And the NIH is very good in terms of also providing important findings from the research they fund to the policymakers and so forth. And Actually, right now they have a mandate that will make a lot of publishers unhappy, but anything funded by NIH now has to be publicly available. You cannot copyright it. You cannot ask money for journals. It doesn't apply to books. But a journal cannot ask for money for an article that is published by NIH anymore. And they are going to be all indexed they all will be on Medline too, and available to the public, to everybody. So that will help maybe a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Just a reminder, this talk is also being videotaped, so if you found it interesting, you can send a link to others. I think that would be a great thing to send the message out to those high and low barred ones. So join us in the Bunnery. Great name.